I think we've started, and that being the case, I'd like to welcome everybody to this event, which is part of what UCU is doing to recognise Trans Awareness Week, which begins today and runs until the 20th of November. I've been asked to chair this event as I chair the LGBT plus Standing Committee, which is one of UCU's Equality Strand committees. So I'm going to say a bit more about how the event is structured and a bit more, and to introduce the speakers. But before we come on to that, I'd like to hand over to the General Secretary of UCU, Joe Grady, who's formally going to introduce the event and to talk about what UCU is doing to mark Trans Awareness Week.
Thank you, Ryan, and thank you to everyone who registered. We had well over 100 people register for this event, and obviously it's a Friday afternoon/evening, so it's really good to see so many people coming and joining us. As Ryan said, today marks the beginning of Trans Awareness Week, and what this week culminates with is a celebration and leading up to the Transgender Day of Remembrance, which you may know memorialises victims of transphobic violence. This is incredibly important for us to celebrate and remember and commemorate, I think, particularly at this time, and particularly in the UK, where we are seeing a government that are revisiting old arguments, are revisiting surveys about the rights of trans and non-binary people. What we've also seen in the last year, and it's been a long-running trend in the UK, is the increase in transphobic hate crime. In the last year, reports have quadrupled over the last 5 years, in the UK. And it's incredibly important for us to not just use this week to celebrate the achievements and lives of trans and non-binary people, but to remind ourselves of how dangerous circumstances still are for our trans and non-binary siblings. We have some really amazing speakers for this event, people who are going to be talking about all different types of activism and research that I think is going to be really interesting for those of you who's joined. But what I wanted to say just before we begin is how important I think this issue is for trade unions, and particularly why I'm so proud of the stance and the position that UCU has consistently taken on trans and non-binary issues. What we are looking at when we see attacks on the dignity, on the humanity, and on the human rights of trans and non-binary people is an attack on the whole human being and an attack on workers. Trade unions are at their strongest when they don't just see their role as to organise people in the workplace, but to organise the entire person, to educate communities, to educate fellow co-workers, and to not stand for any injustice, and to not stand for attacks on minority groups. And I'm proud to say that's what UCU does, and it's what we will continue to do. Because if we don't acknowledge that this is an issue for us as unions, we really limit and curtail the transformational ability of unions to actually make changes, because we don't just want changes in our workplace, we want changes across society. That's what trade unions are. They're emancipatory vehicles. And this isn't something that's peripheral to unions. This is something that is fundamentally central. So I guess for anyone who's either a trade unionist watching this, a UCU member, or an activist in general, really think about what you might do, not just this week, but going forward forever, around trans awareness, around being an ally, around trying to enact change in the circles of influence that you have. And from my experience, that is not arguing with people on the internet. That is not thinking you have to attend a debate or sit on a certain platform. In my experience, we don't organise, we don't educate, we don't change minds by doing those things. We change minds and we organise and we educate by having conversations in our communities, in supporting trans people, non-binary people, their campaigns, in raising awareness, and in actually kind of getting your hands dirty and getting stuck in. So I'm not going to take up any more time because I'm very aware that people are here to hear the amazing speakers. But I just wanted to really leave you with that message, because sometimes I think our activism, particularly around these areas, seems to happen online, can be really draining. It can actually be a real distraction. And I think sometimes it's actually having the wrong conversation with the wrong people. I think, we can set the terms of debate on this. We can organise in our communities, and we can fundamentally listen to what trans and non-binary people need us to do to support them, and actually hand the microphone over rather than speaking ourselves all the time. And with that in mind, there is no better time for me to hand the microphone back over to Ryan so that we can get the event underway. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jo, and I'm sure everybody that's logged in today appreciates the fact that you've found time in what's probably quite a busy calendar to be here to mark the opening of this event and of UCU's various ways of recognising Trans Awareness Week. And that leads me into a plug for some of UCU's resources. You can find, I think, some excellent guidance on gender identity on UCU's website. And if you Google UCU and Trans Awareness Week, that will take you to a page where there are lots of ideas about how to engage in activism at the branch level. It's divided into 3 sections. One of them looks at what should employers be doing to promote equality. Another looks at what the employer should be doing for gender identity equality. And the third section has some ideas about what to do around gender identity monitoring. The comments section is open. The organisers would just like to stress that works best if everyone can keep that as a congenial space. So please feel free to use the comment section, and let's keep it a friendly space. One other thing to mention is that the issues that we're talking about today that are kind of intersectional, obviously, and cross over between different equality strands. So it's worth mentioning, I think, that the Women's Committee, which is another one of the organisations that sits under the NEC in UCU, is also fully committed to trans inclusion. So we're going to start by introducing the first of 3 speakers, and the questions, hopefully we'll have time for some of those before we finish, will be at the end of the event, not after each speaker. So we have 3 speakers today: Flora Renz, Mel McKenna and Ben Vincent. And Flora Renz is going to get things going. Flora is a lecturer in law at Kent Law School and an early career researcher working in the area of gender, feminism and law and the legal regulation identities, particularly for trans and binary people. Flora is currently a co-investigator for the ESRC-funded Future of Legal Gender project. So over to you, Flora.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Ryan, and thank you to Jo for that fantastic intro and really summary of where we stand at the moment, which really ties into a lot of what I'm going to speak about today. I'm going to start by sharing my screen, and I apologize in advance if these are slightly small. That's due to the format of the streaming service, I'm afraid. So what I'm going to talk about, and that's something Jo has really flagged up already, is that, as many of you are going to be aware, in the last couple of years, Britain has faced a very intense debate about how the legal categories of sex and gender should operate, given increasing numbers of people living in genders that do not align with their sex assigned at birth. So people would often describe as trans people, and in people living outside of conventional binary gender categories. And that's not to say that any of this is really new. Trans people have always existed, non-binary people have always existed, but there has been a lot more public and legal awareness around these issues in recent years. For instance, and as Jo mentioned, the recent consultations about reforms to the Gender Recognition Act 2004, which is something I'm going to talk about in more detail in a minute, have attracted a huge amount of public attention, including hostility to the very concept of sex and gender as something that can be changed at all. And much of the public attention around this has centered on how to change procedures for recertification, so for the idea of moving between gender categories in a way that would anchor this in self-declaration, alongside expanding the existing legal categories beyond male and female to include non-binary people in this. And this is at least in part due to the fact that a number of countries have made it easier over the last couple of years for people to change their legal gender marker or adopt a non-binary gender marker or remove their gender entirely from certain official documents. In my presentation today, I'll be talking about the legal framework for gender recognition in the UK, particularly in England and Wales, because the Scottish law now works slightly different, before considering anti-discrimination laws as they stand in the Equality Act 2010, and the ways this applies to trans and non-binary people, before finally thinking a bit more broadly about what inclusion should look like, and particularly what inclusion should look like in the context of universities and in the context of further education, broadly defined. Now, in the UK and in England and Wales in particular, the law has historically taken a slightly inconsistent approach to legal gender. And in fact, we still don't have a proper definition for what this actually means, partially due to the nature of English law, which relies on cases rather than on statute, as other countries do. This inconsistency was even pointed out by a High Court judge in a case that happened 2 years ago about the introduction of X-gender markers. As such, in this country, legal gender status derives from each person's birth certificate and the sex noted on this. So this is where you can formally find your legal gender, as it's noted on your birth certificate. However, actually nowadays, this is only of limited relevance, as birth certificates are now rarely used as identification documents and have largely been superseded by passports and driving licenses, or ID cards for people who have those. They're just much more commonly requested forms of identification. And if you're doing this little exercise at home, you can think about the last time you actually had to produce your birth certificate for anything, or even where you have it right now. It's just rarely needed. The most common context is really marriage, where you actually need to show it. The Gender Recognition Act 2004 was introduced specifically to allow trans people to legally change the sex marker on their birth certificate from male to female or vice versa. This was done in 2004 in response to a judgment by the European Court of Human Rights that said the UK needed to introduce a framework like this. Now, the Gender Recognition Act 2004, when it was introduced, supposedly revolutionized transgender rights in the UK. And it was in fact billed at the time as the most progressive legal framework in the world for gender recognition. And this is because it moved away from a biological understanding of sex or gender, and by making it possible for trans people to change their birth certificates, gain access to legal rights like marriage through that, and as a result, enjoy protection from discrimination in certain areas, particularly around marriage. At the same time, this is a legal framework that comes with fairly onerous requirements for anyone who wants to apply through this. And I've listed them on the slide here under points 1, 2, 3, and 4. And it's also not based on a self-determination model, which by now, so 15 years later, really has become the gold standard, really, for trans recognition. It also doesn't provide recognition for people who don't identify in a binary way with the categories of male and female. As a result, applications for gender recognition certificates, so the document that actually changes your birth certificate, have been consistently very low. And many trans people never actually go through the gender recognition process because this is both very onerous and of limited relevance, as other types of ID documents, such as passports, driving licenses, and so on, can be amended without this. In fact, one of the only instances where the GRA is really relevant in the context of employment is for payroll data, as HMRC records can only be amended through a gender recognition certificate. But in most instances, employees will simply not have a document like this. So it's generally not appropriate for employers to demand this because it is very difficult to obtain, particularly for younger people. Now, we have a framework for legal recognition, which allows you to change your legal records, essentially. But we also, at the same time, have equality law, and this is particularly the Equality Act 2010, which combined a lot of diverse equality legislation at the time. Now, the Equality Act protects everyone from discrimination based on their sex, including their perceived sex. This means that if you are perceived to be a woman, for example, and you're being discriminated against on that basis, it doesn't really matter if you actually are a woman or not, you're still protected from discrimination. Beyond that, under Section 7, which is what I've put on the slide here, the Equality Act also protects people from discrimination on the basis of gender reassignment. And this is the proper kind of legal category, which is often referred to as gender identity in sort of equality policies, but the formal legal language would be gender reassignment. And this effectively prohibits discrimination against trans people on the basis of them having changed their gender. Notably, this is a much broader category than just people who have legally changed their gender marker using the Gender Recognition Act. It includes anyone who has changed their gender, is currently doing so, or is proposing to proposing to do so, which includes both social, medical, and legal forms of transition. So things like changing your name or changing your pronouns or asking to wear a different kind of uniform if you work in a role that requires that. All of these would be seen as types of transitioning, and you would therefore be protected from discrimination. Now, notably, we had an employment tribunal decision that came out a month ago in Taylor and Jaguar Land Rover that found that this category should additionally include non-binary and genderqueer people as also being protected from discrimination. The case involved an employee who identified as non-binary and gender fluid and argued that during her employment, she had been subjected to consistent insults and abusive jokes, and that she suffered difficulties in relation to using facilities and accessing managerial support due to her gender. The court agreed with this assessment and found that non-binary people fell within the remit of Section 7, and therefore this was prohibited discrimination and harassment for the purposes of the Equality Act. Now, the decision in Taylor is, of course, not a binding decision as it comes from an employment tribunal. However, it suggests a clear and growing judicial understanding and awareness that non-binary people also need protection under the law and are, in fact, protected under the law. So this is something really important for employers to be aware of preemptively, as this is something they need to think about in their own day-to-day practice. The anti-discrimination protections under Section 7 mean that anyone who has the protected characteristic of gender reassignment, so trans and now also non-binary people, should not be treated less favorably than somebody who does not have that characteristic in the context, so in the general context of employment and service provision. So this would apply to both staff and students, for instance, in higher education. Section 7 in principle covers all trans and non-binary people, regardless of their legal status, whereas the Gender Recognition Act at present requires a medical diagnosis and is only available to over 18s. Therefore, employers and education providers should not generally demand to see a gender recognition certificate to change someone's name, for instance, or other details, except in very specific circumstances, like, for instance, payroll data, as I mentioned earlier. Now, this means in principle that employees, for instance, who want to use a new name, wear differently gendered clothes, if there's a uniform or dress code, or ask for different pronouns to be used, are protected under the Equality Act and should be accommodated in their requests as far as reasonably possible. So in the same way that an employer generally refers to anyone who is cisgender by their correct name and pronouns, they should do exactly the same thing to trans people, because doing otherwise is discrimination. And it's a little bit sad that that really needs saying. However, Section 7 comes with one big caveat, which is that Schedule 3, paragraph 28, allows the exclusion of people who have gender reassignment from specific single-sex services and accommodation, but only as long as this is a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. And any employer, so a university or service provider, would have to demonstrate that this is actually a proportionate way of achieving this aim. So this means that in practice, this exemption is limited to a fairly narrow range of services and employers, such as, for instance, domestic violence shelters, for instance, where there might be a legitimate reason for excluding trans people. So this is not a blanket exemption. It applies to very narrow circumstances, and in most cases won't apply to universities, for instance. So in general, universities have to abide by Section 7. So we can see from this that kind of equality law is fairly broad in its understanding of gender, while in contrast, options for changing one's legal gender status are still somewhat limited, although it's likely that this will become easier in the fairly near future. But we still have lots of instances where actually we don't do enough to accommodate trans and non-binary people. I'm including here on the slide one example from the UCAS application form from 2018, where the gender categories are still limited to male and female, therefore giving non-binary students, for instance, no option to correctly identify themselves other than being forced into those categories that already exist here. Now, given international developments around this, it seems likely that in the near future, the UK will eventually move towards a self-determination model or the stronger recognition of non-binary identities, although we now already have this in anti-discrimination law. But this is likely going to take some time. This then raises the question of whether, beyond simply legally recognizing people as being a specific gender, there may also be better ways to tackle gender-based inequality, which of course affects everyone and not just trans and non-binary people. We're all somewhat affected by gender inequality, even though some of us may actually benefit from it. But still, we might want to think about whether in we can make sort of accommodations in employment or in sort of service provision, if we think about universities like that, that aren't just beneficial to trans and non-binary people, but actually beneficial to everyone, because we all want to be treated with respect and dignity by our universities. So could we actually think about equality frameworks, and that means equality policies for universities as well, that actually try to address sexist or even cis-sexist norms in employment, rather than just dealing with individual instances of discrimination? Such formal legal change, of course, requires time and political will to implement. However, in the meantime, we do have a clear indication already from the Employment Tribunal and the Equality Act that employers should make reasonable accommodations for trans and non-binary people. And of course, employers who are part of the public sector, so in universities, for instance, have an additional public sector equality duty to generally advance the equality of anyone with a protected characteristic. So beyond just responding to requests from individual employees or students, there is a duty to actually make sure proactively that people feel welcome and included and are seen as equal members of our communities. Because while the Equality Act, of course, sets out a minimum standard of accommodation that is required, there is nothing to prevent universities as employers or service providers from exceeding these standards either, as long as this doesn't amount to discrimination in other ways. This could take the form, for instance, of allowing employees and students to easily register their preferred name and pronouns, which is particularly vital in the age of online teaching, where we often don't even see each other, or we don't see our students face to face. As well as making sure that public-facing records such as Moodle, Blackboard, or whatever software a university uses, as well as university email addresses, can all be amended to correctly reflect a user's preferred name, for instance. This is particularly important for students who, due to their age, are unlikely to be able to legally change their gender prior to entering university, and who may face particular challenges in terms of documents such as secondary school results that are often regulated by the Department for Education and cannot easily be changed to correctly reflect their name or gender. So kind of particular sensitivity is required around providing references for employment or for internships, for instance, as well as providing degree results that are suitable to the student and their identity. But trans and non-binary inclusion can also extend to more substantive measures, like, for example, ensuring that paid leave for carers and sufficient entitlement to medical leave, regardless of a person's specific family configurations or gender, is readily available to anyone who needs it, as well as ensuring that staff and students have access to relevant facilities on campus, such as bathrooms that align with their gender, and accessibility requirements around disability, for instance, as well as facilities for nursing or childcare, for example. Similarly, and as data collection is becoming more and more crucial for employers, it's important to be mindful of what data they are trying to collect and why. For instance, in some contexts, someone's legal sex may indeed be relevant information, for example, in the context of payroll data, which is kind of the example I keep coming back to. But in other instances, may be more relevant how somebody identifies or how they are perceived in their day-to-day life. So to identify instances of discrimination, for instance, it often actually doesn't matter what's on your birth certificate because nobody can see it. Instead, what people can see is what you look like, for instance. So this may be a much more relevant criterion in those contexts. And there may also be instances where it simply doesn't matter what somebody's sex or gender is. And in those instances, those categories should probably be removed instead of requiring people to fill them out over and over again. So really what I want to leave this at is a call to be mindful towards our community as a whole, because measures that include what are often seen as minority interests also benefit all of us. The more inclusive we make higher education as an environment for staff and students, the better this really is for everyone. And we should treat everybody with the same kind of respect that we want to be treated with, rather than giving in completely to the sort of very neoliberal individualist ideology that seems to be taking over more and more of higher education. I'm going to leave it at that. And thank you again so much for inviting me. And thank you to Seamus for signing along to all of this.
Thank you very, very much, Flora. I'm going to be in more closer, I'm afraid, because I think that helps with the sound quality. So thank you very much for sharing that expertise and your overview of how UK legislation has developed over the last 16 years and where it sits now relative to an international context, and also for taking the discussion into the area of how the law by itself isn't going to achieve the culture of dignity and mutual respect that we all want to see. So I'd like now to introduce the second speaker in today's event, Mel McKenna. Mel is a non-binary queer person living and working in Glasgow. Mel has been a UCU branch rep at Glasgow Caledonian University and is currently a member of the UCU LGBT+ committee. Mel is going today to talk to us about experiences of working in higher education and engaging in union work as a non-binary person. So over to you, Mel.
Thanks, Ryan, and thanks to Flora for getting us started there. I'm just going to share my screen. I've got a few slides, so just bear with me for a second. Okay. Sorry about that. I think that's us now. So yeah, hi everyone, and thanks for joining us. So yeah, as Ryan said, today I wanted to share my experiences of working in higher education as a non-binary person. So I'm going to look at this in terms of my experiences of kind of specifically working in student wellbeing, as well as my experiences of engaging with union work at a more local level. So yeah, I work as a disability advisor at Glasgow Caledonian University, and our focus is primarily on developing accessibility and inclusive teaching practice, and to provide a range of support to disabled and neurodiverse students. I'm also involved in other aspects of equality work at GCU and regularly work closely with our Equality and Diversity Advisor and our Student Wellbeing Advisor. An example of the type of work that I would be involved in there is supporting colleagues to develop trans awareness sessions for academic staff. I'm also the very new co-chair of the Trans Edu Community of Practice, which is Scotland-based, and it's where further and higher education colleagues can come together and discuss how we could better support trans and gender diverse students and staff in education. So we're currently putting together some guidance for supporting trans and gender diverse people in an online and teaching and learning environment. I think we all know how much COVID has impacted on everything, so that's sort of taken our focus for the moment. Until recently, I was also the equality rep for my local UCU branch, which was a great opportunity, and it enabled me to get a lot more involved in union work at local and national level. Yeah, and I recently also worked with a colleague from Strathclyde, Dr. Stephanie McKendry, and we produced a thought piece exploring the binary nature of the hidden curriculum within HE. So that's recently been published by Advance HE. If anyone's interested, you can go on and have a look at it. You might need to be a member, but I think a lot of folk watching hopefully are members of Advantage HE. If not, I can always try and get copies sent later. So yeah, I'm going to chat about my experiences of being open about my gender and the impact this has had specifically on students that I work with, and then I'll move on to speaking more specifically about engaging with local union work and how unions can kind of widen access and engage more non-binary people in more active union work. So yeah, I've been out and openly LGBT for quite a long time, but have been more recently open about my gender, which I had been thinking about for a long time, but was apprehensive to talk openly about it. This kind of combined with the hostility kind of trans and gender diverse people often face, particularly through the media, made it more difficult to speak openly, and I was quite reluctant for quite a long time. I do think that working in student wellbeing is quite a unique position to be in within higher education, because of the nature of the work that we do and the range of students that we support, and I definitely think that made it easier for me to have open discussions with colleagues when I felt more ready to. It was extremely helpful for me to have colleagues that were, are open to learning and understanding more about gender, more generally about LGBT identity. Although it still feels like you're taking a risk in opening that dialogue, you can't always know for sure how someone might perceive that when you speak to them. So yeah, for me, the best thing about being a visible kind of non-binary member of staff is the positive impact I've seen this having on students. When I was a student myself, I would have really appreciated seeing more LGBT visibility around campus, just generally. I didn't really feel a sense of kind of inclusivity or university being necessarily a safe space for me to talk openly about this kind of thing. The curriculum itself was very binary. The language within the curriculum we used was extremely binary. And I found it hard to kind of meet other students that I could relate to or share experiences with. So in terms of my current role and the work that I'm doing with students, as a disability advisor, the focus there is working with disabled and neurodiverse students, but there's huge intersections, as we all know, and I work with many LGBT students. So I feel that it seems to be noticeable to me that the students feel kind of more able to speak openly about themselves, and that's something I really value. So from conversations that I've had with them, it seems clear that having a visible LGBT member of staff in student wellbeing is significant for them. And I think it makes them feel a bit more represented and maybe a bit more hopeful, at least at the service in general, wellbeing inclusive service. So it's just little things like putting kind of posters on my door, using inclusive language throughout my discussions with students, putting my pronouns in my email signature, on my Zoom account, all of those things I think have helped increase that visibility, which is always important, possibly even more so now because of the move to online teaching and learning and the kind of isolation that's creating for a lot of our students. Non-binary and gender diverse students can face additional challenges and barriers working from home. And I hope to be able to offer some sort of safe online environment where students feel they can talk with me openly if they want to and are able to, without worrying about whether they'll be, misunderstood or judged. So just move on to my next slide. So I'm going to move on now and talk more specifically about my union work. At a local level, I'm going to focus on sort of branch level. I've been a UCU member for quite a few years, really, but wasn't actively involved until just early last year. I wanted to be more involved, but I was kind of reluctant to take that step for a few different reasons. The main concern I had was that I wasn't sure whether my local branch would be LGBT, and obviously for myself specifically, would be inclusive of other genders, whether it would be very binary focused and what the sort of level of understanding might be around trans and non-binary identities. I wasn't sure whether there were other LGBT members on the committee or attended meetings, things like that. I also just didn't really know whether branch meetings could potentially be hostile or unsafe or just uncomfortable environment for me to attend, because again, with everything that kind of goes on in the media, there's a lot of very difficult kind of dialogue happening at the moment. So, I just couldn't be sure what my local branch feeling was around that kind of thing. So I appreciate obviously that branch meetings can be tense and they're a space to debate and have difficult conversations. That's of course, what unions are really there for. But at that point, I didn't feel confident to attend the meeting without kind of finding these things out first. So that kind of lack of anxiety and kind of that lack of confidence, and kind of anxiety really stopped me for quite a long time taking that next step. I obviously knew what UCU's position, is at a national level, but it can still feel quite intimidating reaching out at a more local level. Eventually did decide to take that step, and I knew I just had to take a bit of a risk if I wanted to engage with more union work and make an impact. But I started having informal conversations with colleagues, just kind of getting a bit of a feel for how kind of meetings tend to be and, what gets discussed and kind of other colleagues that go to the branch meetings, what their kind of thoughts were on that. And just kind of piecing together a sense of how I might feel when I go to one. So yeah, to kind of skip forward, I ended up kind of getting more involved, eventually taking on the role of equality rep, which is really valuable for me, opened up so many avenues for me to get much more involved. Things like this, standing on the LGBT standing committee, attending different conferences, and I've recently stepped down from that because I think it's important to give different people opportunities to kind of take that role on. So I've been thinking a lot about my experience, and of course this is just my personal experience, and how local branches can encourage more non-binary people to engage with the union. I know that there will be loads of branches already doing this work, and I know there's maybe a bit of inconsistency across the country because there's so many branches and so many different things happening. But I've identified some key areas that I think are a good starting point for engaging more trans and gender diverse people. First, and probably the most important thing for me really, is visibility. Don't assume that people, trans and gender diverse people, will know that you're a safe space for them. I can't know that you're a safe space unless you show me that in some way. So this could be anything from running campaigns, just making these visible across the campus, or using social media in a positive way, sending emails with information. If there's an LGBT group, advertising this. And I do think it's great to use weeks like Trans Awareness Week as a platform to run events and share information. But for me, visibility is important year round. And, there should be an ongoing commitment to doing that work. And I think Joe picked up on that as well. And obviously recognising that it's not just something that you can really tag to a specific week, but, we need to kind of do the work year round. And that goes without saying for all equality strands as well. Obviously, communication is really important. It's really helpful to hear updates about what's happening in the branch just generally. That can encourage more people to attend meetings, and that would hopefully encourage a more diverse branch as well. I would love to see kind of information being shared about, again, different local events, training, and just general information about what equality work that the branch is doing. And again, this might differ branch to branch, but it'd be really great if there were quite a few members kind of focusing on equality rather than just one. That's something I found quite difficult as a equality rep. There's so much there. One person can't possibly cover like everything that's happening all the time. So that's definitely something to consider. The use of social media, which again feeds into communication. It's a great tool, but it can also be quite a toxic place. I had to delete Twitter recently because it was creating quite a lot of anxiety and it was having quite a negative, effect on my mental health. But then that's a place where UCU is really active and there's so many kind of positive things there. And I feel like by deleting that, I'm missing out a little bit on what other branches are doing. So not sure what the answer is there, but it's just definitely something to flag up. And yeah, finally, kind of good old pronouns. All I would say on that one is if someone tells you what the pronoun is, try your best to use that pronoun. If you get it wrong, correct yourself and try to get it right. Everyone gets pronouns wrong, but we do need to make a conscious effort to get used to that language and just keep reframing that person in your mind. Train your brain to think of that person with that pronoun associated. I don't personally like the term preferred pronoun because it kind of suggests that's the option. You don't have to use it if you don't want to. For me, it's just my pronoun. And again, like if you can state your pronoun, if you can make use of that openly, that's really, really helpful. Keep in mind, not everyone would be comfortable doing so. For me, enforcing pronouns isn't going to work for everyone either. So I've got one more slide. I know there's questions coming at the end, but there was a couple that I had been asked to kind of pick up specifically, just because they were quite related to what I was talking about. So we're kind of pushed a wee bit for time, so I will run through these quite quickly. So the first one that came through, and thanks to everyone that sent through questions, was how to ensure students feel safe and the freedom to be themselves at all times, particularly students getting into school placements. How do we best support students? So that's a really important question. I could talk about that for hours, but for me, the key is, again, visibility and positive representation across all areas. So from the curriculum to student wellbeing, to the student association, to social media, I think this work needs to be embedded and not just something that's seen as optional. So we often see like a single module for equality work or 1 or 2 lectures where you cover the equality strands, but the actual course itself is not inclusive. The language is very binary. For more information, I would recommend this book. It's not a plug because it's not my book, but it's a really, really good book. So it's called Supporting Transgender and Non-Binary Staff and Students in Further and Higher Education. This offers lots of practical advice for colleges and universities, and there's specific sections around placements too. Because I know from supporting students, through placements, they've got their own kind of specific issues and barriers there. So the next question was, as a prospective educator in HE, how can I best approach a trans student if I misgender them wrongly? So very quickly, just to kind of cover that, I think just having an informal one-to-one chat with the student, it's going to be different for everyone. There's no one way that fits everything. I'd rather someone just directly ask me my pronouns than make assumptions or continually misgender me. So yeah, I'll move on from that one. And the final question, any best practice to share on ensuring university admin systems and databases don't continually misgender or dead name trans and non-binary folk? At Glasgow Caledonian University, we've got a named contact for trans students, and for us, that's our Student Wellbeing advisor. I think there can be pros and cons to having a single named contact, but as far as having a straightforward and streamlined process for students who need support with things like changing their name, it has worked really well so far. It means a student can just speak with one person who can then action everything and liaise with places like IT and academic departments and so on. So for the practical side of things, I think that's worked really well. So I think that's pretty much me. Thanks everyone for listening, and I can, put it back to Ryan now.
Thank you very much, Mel, and for sharing your experiences with the event today, and for your insights on some of the reservations people may have about assuming a non-binary identity and how it is that someone can find the confidence and support to do that. And no doubt much of what you say will find a resonance with others in higher education and in union activism and representation. And I think that people will also find very helpful the ideas for good practice that you've shared in terms of communicating with students and with raising visibility. So we're moving on now to the third and final speaker today, Ben Vincent. Ben is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Open University and is working on a project called Integrating Care for Trans Adults. Ben has authored 2 books, Transgendered Health and Non-Binary Gender, is the former chair of the Gender Identity Research and Education Society, and currently sits on the committee writing the 8th edition of the International Standards of Care within the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. So over to you, Ben.
Thank you very much, Ryan, and thank you to Joe and Seamus and the other speakers. And so the rough request that I was given was to speak about what trans people, including non-binary people, go through and come up against. And this would be a pretty hard brief, even if it was an hour-long keynote, particularly because I can't know where everyone listening is at with this or what people's experience or knowledge is. So I'm going to sidestep some issues, particularly the discussion of terminology and also the potentially bewildering debates about what sex and gender are, the ontological and epistemological elements, how these socially organizing concepts relate to each other and so on. And I want to take a single concept and focus on relating it to some of the larger factors that shape experiences of being trans in the UK right now. So, of course, this is in a broader social context of immense stress and difficulty for most of us. We cannot think about what any minority population is up against or going through, honestly, without underscoring COVID, climate change, the prospect of chaos as the Brexit transition period ends, and the pervasive, insidious, and enduring roles of intersecting inequalities. In short, if you want to understand what trans people face, that necessitates engaging with systemic racism, sexism, classism, and ableism, to name the sort of often most cited but by no means exhaustive ideas. So the single concept that I mentioned wanting to focus on, however, is cisnormativity, which may or may not be a familiar term. And I want to highlight this as distinguishable from transphobia, although it is related. So a reasonable working definition might be, if we think about structural phenomena or interpersonal experiences or ingrained individual views that situate cis people, that is not trans people, and being cis as normal. Not the majority, but specifically as normal, and in doing so, discursively situating people outside of cisness as abnormal. If not being trans is positioned as what it means to be simple, then trans becomes complex, difficult, different, alien, other. There are limits to the cis-trans binary for sure. This has been written about academically for many years, but it works as a basic kind of tool, as a heuristic when applied in context. And the context that I mainly want to look at with the limited time I have is healthcare. So being trans is associated with transition, which can mean different things to different people. But in very broad brushstrokes, we can think about healthcare as gender affirming medical interventions on the one hand, and everything else on the other. And it was only in 2018 that the World Health Organization stopped categorizing trans status as a mental disorder. The entire field of trans healthcare has been largely dominated by psychology and psychiatry, despite the interventions being largely endocrinological or surgical. And this is a historical artifact resulting from how cis people conceptualized trans people. The framing in white Western context of gender diversity as rare, deviant, and potentially psychosexual is why adult care across England today has until very recently been limited to 7 specialised services. Trans people must navigate an assessment process to establish whether they can access medical interventions. And this may sound reasonable enough, but takes as its starting point the presumption that everyone is cis until proven otherwise. The historically valorized logic defends doctors as the gatekeepers of healthcare access on the basis that someone might be making a mistake. And while I don't have time to do justice to the experiences of regret, these are lower for gender affirming medical interventions than practically anything, and largely associated with lack of support rather than not being trans. And it's worth considering that things that society agitates around, questions of regret, autonomy, impact, and reversibility. So marriage has much higher regret rates, and receiving a poor choice of tattoo is far harder to reverse than even months of being on exogenous hormone use, for example. We treat these very differently in terms of access and fear and moral panic. So the point that I'm making is that trans people do not have autonomy over their ability to exist as themselves. And while the NHS has suffered under conservative mismanagement and underfunding for many years, the average waiting time for a first appointment with a gender identity clinic now sits at anywhere between 2 and 4 years, with even longer waits very much possible. People then wait years for follow-up appointments, can be coerced into unnecessary genital examinations, asked to explain if or how they have sex or their masturbatory habits. In a research interview I conducted last week, a participant disclosed how a clinician made a point of asking them whether they had a sexual interest in children. And this happened a year ago, not 50 years ago. And while this is certainly a transphobic discourse that echoes a homophobic trope weaponized against gay people for many years, the wider point about how healthcare has been conceived and constructed is that it has never functioned to serve trans people. In the context of the GP surgery, there's the colloquially named trans broken arm syndrome, where the most mundane and irrelevant of healthcare needs circle back to gender. And there is a problem with some healthcare providers not seeing the whole person, but only trans status when it's known or disclosed. And as a second example to health, I want to briefly touch upon the consultation which was held by the government over the last 2 years regarding reform of the Gender Recognition Act, the piece of legislation that's already been talked about by Thora in our first talk. The scope and severity of misinformation that was propagated during this consultation period, magnified by hostility across the political spectrum of media outlets, served to throw proverbial gasoline on our current neoliberal viral dystopia as trans people are experiencing it. And it can be profoundly difficult to appreciate why the new call for evidence from the Women and Equalities Committee on the government's response and a further call focused on toilet provisions have inspired an overarching response of exhaustion, exasperation, and fear across quite disparate trans and gender diverse communities. I try and avoid talking about the trans community as if there was one and that views held by that group are the same. They're not. There is enormous diversity. To some extent, to be trans is not to be confident who you can count on, which echoes a point I think Mel made. Gender identity has been targeted as a potential wedge issue by the right, undermining emancipatory political solidarity and efficacy. And there's a profound need for those who wish to better understand and support trans people to take the lead regarding education, as there's now a rich range of accessible material written and produced by trans people for exactly this. And I'm going to show a few examples that I've got. So a really good sort of first way in, but still very good for people who know quite a bit, is Trans Like Me by C.N. Lester. For a more academic look at, from an academic feminist approach, I'd recommend Whipping Girl, a Transsexual Woman on Sexism and the Scapegoating of Femininity by Julia Serrano. There's more than one edition of that one, so there's different covers now. And for a book that looks quite a lot beyond transness, I'd suggest Life Isn't Binary by Meg John Barker and Alexian Taffy. For general advice, I'd say we all need to be active in unlearning tropes, biases, and cisnormativity, because allyship isn't something that you are, but is ultimately a function of what you do and how you respond to people. Being corrected, having people maybe engage with you in ways that aren't always kind, aren't always sympathetic, and thinking, what has caused that anger, that sensitivity? Maybe it's not about me or an individual in the moment, but about structural problems. We're all shaped by systemic inequalities that I've already mentioned: racism, patriarchy. Cisnormativity is part of the same ugly framework, and we can only respond to that with determination and humility. And I want to stop there so that we've got a little time for questions. But thank you, Seamus, for your signing, and thank you very much for listening.
Thanks, Ben. And it's really good, especially in a union context, I think, to hear somebody bring into the discussion issues of class, the category famously left out of the Equality Act, and which nevertheless determines so much who we are and who we can be. And the way you've looked at how health, gender and trans paradigms and structures intersect raises lots of thorny questions, and it's really good in an education context like this to see someone sharing not just a reading list, but physical books before we forget what those are. So thanks again very much for that, and to Mel and Laura for the previous presentations. I think if, depending on what the organisers behind the scenes say, we may or may not now look at some questions. What are we doing on that, Seth? Oh, yeah, we are. Okay, so the first question we have here, which hopefully you can see on the screen, is what is the #1 way that universities can support trans and non-binary people? And I think it's already been decided who among the presenters will address that question. So can we go to Ben?
I'll try and keep this brief because I appreciate we only have a few minutes. It's obviously a question which simplifies because everyone's different and everyone has different needs. So I would say the #1 way universities can support trans and non-binary people is to be responsive and holistic. You've got to engage with the situation as it emerges, and be prepared to be constantly learning. There isn't an end goal that people get to where you can say, I get it now and I know everything. That just simply isn't possible. And so I would say it's about the approach, which really has a lot of translatability into any and all responses to oppression and systemic inequality. Listen and be guided by the person in the context.
Great, thank you. Are we moving on now to look at another question? Okay, so the question you can see on your screens now, hopefully, is what is the best training specifically related to and or targeting trans respect that we can advocate for, in addition to generic ones such as active bystander, unconscious bias, etc.? And maybe if among the presenters, if you're willing to address this question, you could perhaps pop that in the private chat. I don't know, Mel, perhaps as you were covering this area, this might be something, or Flora, if you could speak to this.
Well, so I think I'm a little bit hesitant to recommend any kind of training because there's always a bit of an issue of preaching to the converted. The people who end up doing the trainings the most are the people who least need them a lot of the time. But there are good resources provided for by Gendered Intelligence, for instance, by Stonewall as well. They have a fairly comprehensive set of materials around this. But I think in general, it can be really helpful for universities to engage with NGOs who work on these issues because they often have much better expertise than universities themselves. And as always, actually pay the people who provide those trainings to do that, because often this falls to the people who are already struggling the most. It often falls to trans and non-binary people to have to do all the explaining, just like it does with race. It falls to BME people with disability. It falls to disabled people to do this themselves. So I think it's really important that employers invest in this properly so it's resourced fully.
Okay, great. I hope that answers the question, or begins to answer it anyway. Are we going to move on to another question? We should have another one on the screen. Yeah. So we're looking here at a question that says, many people think of trans women first when trans rights are mentioned. What can we do to shift the focus onto trans men and non-binary people who are often overlooked? And if you're still there, Mel, perhaps that's a question for you.
I think things like this, I think just opening up more space and giving more opportunities for trans men and non-binary people to share their experiences. That's probably the biggest thing, really. That's a really big question, but I think just engaging more with more people.
Okay, and it's not for me to answer the questions, as I'm not one of the presenters, but I think some of the information that's on the webpage that UCU's created for the Trans Awareness Week could be useful in terms of looking at the answers to some of these questions that have come in. So do we have time for another one? Another question? Okay. This one is, what have been some of the most effective bathroom access practices implemented in this area in higher education institutions? So.
Okay, so this is a topic of serious debate. I would point towards there was a funded cross-disciplinary project called Around the Toilet, which explored toilets as places of exclusion and belonging, that was based at Sheffield Hallam University. And they have a blog, aroundthetoilet.wordpress.com, and I believe they've had various outputs thinking about like how people engage with toilet spaces, not just in relation to trans status, but also we can see how this cuts across disability and access needs in relation to how buildings are built and physical space and decisions in design and funding and enormous amount of factors. The big question about gender neutral spaces is people can be concerned about safety. And I suppose it's a question of individual stalls is what people want, isn't it? Like that way you have privacy, safety, but there are reasons why one might want women's bathrooms, and it's bad when we see just everything else converted into gender neutral, particularly when disabled toilets just become the gender neutral toilet, and you kind of erase the specificity of what something was built for and like create additional load. And this relates back to class politics as well, like wanting to minimize the spend on marginalized groups and kind of shut it under the rug in various ways. There's a lot that could be said, but I would suggest looking at that project and seeing what they say.
Okay, many thanks, Ben. I'm not sure if we're still on from looking at the private chat, if the session is effectively stopped, or if we're still going. But in any case, we do need to draw things to a close now. But before we do that, I'd just like to thank again the three speakers today for very engaging, thoughtful, and carefully thought through presentations that I think have addressed the remit of this week very effectively. Also to thank the UCU colleagues behind the scenes, Seth Atkin and Jenny Sherrod, for putting this together, and Joe Grady for being here to get things going, and also to Seamus Henry, who's been doing BSL interpreting for the speakers and for these inserts between presentations. And I hope those of you who've been logged in today have found this a useful event, and we'll take up some of the other things that UCU is doing this week to recognise and to mark Trans Awareness Week. So many thanks again to the speakers for being here and to everyone who's logged in. I think we're stopping there. Have a good week.